First up here, we have Christine Kuo. She is a master's student coming to us from the University of British Columbia. And she's going to chat with us today about how we can better understand human behavior change and then use that to help farmers make better choices for the welfare of their animals. Take it away, Christine.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. My name is Christine, and my project is called Understanding How Farmers Change Practices, Switching to Social Housing for Dairy Calves. So you can see in this picture here is an example of social housing, which is when 2 or more calves are kept together during the pre-weaning period. Farmers usually have calves in individual housing, though. There's a picture as an example, and that is due to various concerns such as calf health. But social housing can benefit animal welfare, which is why the National Farm Animal Care Council, through the Code of Practice for the Care and Handling of Dairy Cattle, is recommending that farmers adopt social housing in the coming years. However, little is known about how and why a farm might adopt a social housing setup, especially after they had been using an individual setup for many years. So let's say you were a farmer that wanted to start socially housing your calves. Roger's innovation decision process would describe your process as going something like this. First, you would learn about it. Then you would form an attitude towards social housing. If it's a positive attitude, then you will come to the decision to adopt it. And then you will implement it on your farm. You might reinvent your social housing setup, meaning that you'll change it in minor ways to better fit the needs of your farm. And then from there, your decision to use social housing will be confirmed, either to continue adoption or discontinue its use. So this framework belongs to a group of theories called innovation adoption theories, which describes the process of starting something new. So we wanted to apply this to the question of social housing to understand producers' experiences with adopting social housing, especially looking at this process over time. I'm going to focus on results from the latter half of the innovation decision process. And if you'd like to know about the first half, you can read my thesis. So I did in-person interviews with 17 participants at 15 different farms with 2 groups of people. 12 of the farms were considered continuers because they continue to do social housing today. And 3 of the farms were considered discontinuers because they've discontinued doing social housing and they've gone back to individual housing. The average interview length was 86 minutes, and the interview guide structure started off with a narrative introduction where you invite someone to say everything that they remember about a process. And then I asked questions based on that innovation decision process that I showed you earlier to further probe into what their experience was at the time. I also created timelines of calf housing changes with farmers and then conducted a thematic analysis on the resulting transcripts, which is when you categorize patterns in text into themes that have shared meaning. So first, I'm going to start with talking about the continuers, who are the people who still do social housing today. And throughout the rest of the slides, you can follow where we are on this innovation decision process on the bottom of the slide. So when we start at implementation, which is when the farm had implemented social housing, participants faced and continue to face various challenges, including cross-sucking, calf health, and competition. Cross-sucking is when calves suck on the body parts of other calves, and farmers are concerned that it will result in a blind quarter, which is when that teat that was sucked on will not produce milk when the calf matures. So we heard about intersucking in a previous presentation, and this is a similar concept. So this one farmer said, the only reason why I hate this system is the cross-sucking. Nothing is more frustrating than investing 2 years worth of finances and time into raising a healthy cow to come into milk, and she comes in and she has a blind quarter. However, these challenges were very farm dependent. Things that were a challenge for one farm were considered a non-issue for other farms. So we have this person saying that their ability to monitor individual calf health in a social setup was not a difficulty for them, saying you can still monitor pretty good. We're in there twice a day, and you can notice if they're sick because they're not getting up. Meanwhile, for other farms, individual monitoring was actually a challenge. Participants also saw and continue to see benefits from social housing, including benefits to calf growth, socialization, and reduced labor needs for the farmers. Here we have an example of someone saying they're a herd animal and they like to lean on each other. So they like the physical contact and they, I think, are calmer or happier that way. So this person was really highlighting the benefits of socialization to the calf's emotional state. One phenomenon I find really interesting is reinvention, which is when the participant would modify their original setup to better work for their farm or fix a specific issue. Reinvention can be successful, meaning that it fixed the issue, or it can be unsuccessful, meaning it didn't. Despite some failures in reinvention, people in this continuers group managed to reinvent their system if needed to fix problems. An example of a successful reinvention was this one farmer who started feeding calves more milk and with a bottle and successfully managed cross-sucking, saying otherwise they would just basically chug it and then they still wouldn't have that sucking satisfaction. But an example of an unsuccessful reinvention is this one farmer who originally was grouping calves at a few days of age and then ended up pushing it to 4 weeks of age during the pre-weaning period because other attempts to manage disease didn't work. So this person said, we were just throwing dollars at this, trying to make ventilation. Then it was ventilation, then it was this, then it was that. We vaccinated up to the wazoo. So it was a frustrating experience. During this reinvention process, producers used a variety of problem-solving approaches, including collecting data and involving their vet. Sometimes the experience was frustrating, but some participants acknowledged that trial and error was necessary. Here we have one person saying that it took 2 years to get their calf barn with a group setting to work properly. So finally, these people are at the confirmation stage where they've decided to continue social housing for now. When they were asked why they wanted to continue it, they reiterated the benefits of social housing and explained how they felt the benefits outweighed the challenges. This person said, I think the housing is so much better for calves. They're happy, they're easier to feed, they have more room to run and play, they're learning how to interact as a group. You just have to try and mitigate the sucking. The benefits outweigh it for us. At the same time, they did still acknowledge that there were some benefits to individual housing and sometimes felt a strong resistance to socially housing calves at a younger age. So back to this farmer who had struggled with calf health and had that unsuccessful reinvention where they ended up needing to push the age of grouping to 4 weeks. This person is, for obvious reasons perhaps, very resistant to the idea of grouping their calves at a younger age. So now let's talk about the discontinuers. I only had 3 farms that were considered discontinuers, but they do have an interesting story to tell about adoption. They saw similar benefits like calf growth and socialization, as well as similar challenges like calf health and cross-sucking to the farmers in the continuers group. But where they differed is they struggled to manage the challenges associated with social housing. Here we have an example of an unsuccessful reinvention where this farm put in a new group feeder to see if it would help with challenges with calf health. It didn't work. And then they expressed frustration saying, the worst thing with calves is if you have to cull a calf. It sucks. It's terrible and nobody wants to have to deal with that. Now these 3 farms are at the discontinuation stage where they have decided to stop doing social housing. And some felt a very strong resistance to it. One person said, I can see the benefit of social development, but the first thing is they have to live. That's number 1. And that was because this person had a group set up and then experienced high rates of calf mortality and decided to discontinue it because of that. As a whole, I want to highlight that the adoption cycle never ends. Producers discuss potential new additions and changes to their calf setup that they were planning for the future, kind of showing us how practices on farms are constantly changing. One example is this one farmer who is going to move their calf groups to a new barn to improve airflow and said, yeah, we like change. Some limitations of this work is that the interviews were relying on participants' memory and narrative of past events. So there is the risk that it doesn't reflect exactly what was happening at the time. At the same time, it does tell us how they have synthesized and understood their past experiences. But a study approach that would more accurately reflect reality would be a longitudinal study where you follow people throughout the process of adopting social housing. I tried to mitigate this by using a variety of techniques. The timelines were an interactive way to help people remember what had happened previously on their farm. And in some cases, these timelines did go back to the 1960s or 70s where people told me what their father was doing. I also used narrative interviewing, which is that process where you ask people to recount everything that they remember. And that is a technique that is used by police at crime scenes, where they ask witnesses to recount everything they remember. So it really helps to jog your memory. I also had a small sample size of people in that discontinuers group. And that was not due to a lack of trying. I hypothesized that this is for two reasons. One is that if someone discontinues social housing, they may see it as a failure and they may be hesitant to talk about their personal failures. Another one is that there may not be many discontinuers. Especially, I think if you have built a new calf barn to put in a social housing setup, you would be very hesitant to try and discontinue it, and you may try to find a way to make it work. Lastly, this is a qualitative work that is not intended to be representative or generalizable to all dairy farms in Canada, and is rather intended to give an in-depth account of people's experiences. So what does this research tell us about the adoption of new practices? One is that adoption is a dynamic and lengthy process. Reinvention in particular took time, and practices on farms were always changing. From a social housing standpoint, I want to highlight that people who were in the continuers group might end up discontinuing social housing in the future, and likewise, people that were in the discontinuers group may decide to adopt it. And I also saw that in my data set, given that some participants went back and forth from individual to social housing more than once. Another broad result is that challenges and benefits of social housing are farm specific. So something that was a challenge for someone was a non-issue for someone else. And reinvention and problem solving, I think, must be very tailored to these differences between individual farms. Lastly, reinvention seems to be a key part of this process, and producers may need support during that stage to continue on with new practices or risk discontinuation. So in the interviews, people mentioned things like vet involvement or doing benchmarking and monitoring of their calves to be a helpful process. And so those might be potential strategies to help people with the reinvention process. I lastly would like to extend my thanks to all of the participants who graciously let me on their farms and to the funders of this work. And I'm happy to answer any questions.